Good morning. My name is Tim Chen. I'm the chair of AID Northwest Board of Directors. Welcome you all to this community meeting. We were just discussing unusual and difficult to get used to doing the community meeting in this particular, using this particular method. It's sort of disconcerting. I like to do it, prefer to do it face to face. Anyway, we have a fairly full program today. I'll just give you a few brief remarks, and then Deborah Cruz, our program manager, will talk a little bit about where we are today. We are certainly because of the COVID-19, entirely different situation, and she'll discuss a little bit how we're coping with that. She will be followed by Anne Recinos. Excuse me a second while I get her information. It's Anne Recinos, is a staff attorney, at the Northwest Immigrants Rights Project, where she has formed part of the legal orientation program team since 2017. Her work at NERP consists of a mixture of direct representation and pro se assistance for people detained at the Northwest Detention Center. She's a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School and Brown University. She is originally from Miami, Florida. As an aside, we found out that she and I both, I went to graduate school in Miami also, so we have that, such a small world, we have that background. Behind that, after Anne, will be Tonia Honeycutt. Tonia is our member of our board of directors, and she will discuss different release categories, give you a presentation, and give you a better idea of what we're the immigration process. We will leave time at the end for Q&A. Please use the Q&A portion of your screen, and Stephanie Duran, who is also on the board, will be the moderator for that Q&A session. Well, with that, we will start with Deborah. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. As Tim said, I'm going to be talking about how COVID-19 has affected our programs. And I'm going to show you a graph. Okay, so here's a graph of how people visiting the Welcome Center and how they have decreased significantly. As you can see, in June, we only had 36 people visiting the Welcome Center. Our dedicated Welcome Center volunteers continue to operate outdoors under tents with our new COVID-19 procedures in place, and we thank them all for dedicating their time to that program. Our transportation program volunteers continue to take people to the bus and train and hotels and airports. And our visitation volunteers are keeping in contact with people by writing letters and doing some video calls. We continue to support people inside by giving them phone account money with the assistance of Northwest Immigrants Rights Project. Our hospitality house is open for people who need to wait a few hours for rides, and we have implemented a new policy for people to stay long-term while they're waiting for their court dates and work permits. We currently have 4 rooms available, and due to CDC requirements, they will have to be quarantined for 2 weeks after release or be tested for COVID-19 due to social distancing requirements in shared spaces. Our marketing team has been hard at work writing the newsletter. Special thanks to Betty Devereaux, who writes these articles, Christine, who is our editor for everything, and of course the rest of the marketing and communications team for their input and dedication to this. If you have not read the newsletter, you can. It was emailed out on Monday, but you can also see it on our website at www.AIDNW.org. If there's any questions, you can ask me now. And if not, I will turn this over to Anne Recinos from Northwest Immigrants Rights Project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debbie. I was asked to start maybe with a story to sort of illustrate how it might look like if one is detained at the Northwest Detention Center, how long it takes. And so without going into any great detail over anybody's specific case, I would say that sometimes we see meritorious and successful cases last more than 13 months is my longer end of the spectrum. Typically, I would say it's closer to the 6-month mark, but that's still quite a long time to be in detention. Sometimes the longer stretches happen when there's an appeal process, but on at least 2 occasions where I represented folks that were detained at the Northwest Detention Center, both of those individuals remained around 13 months in the detention center, despite having successfully won their case before the immigration court and then having to defend it while still detained in front of the Board of Immigration Appeals. So it can be quite a long time that people end up waiting in the Northwest Detention Center. And in terms of numbers now, what does that look like? That's the main focus, I think, of why I was asked to speak today. I don't have hard numbers. We, in historical times before Trump, actually even post-Trump for a bit, the Northwest Immigrants Rights Project did receive lists of people who are being brought into the Northwest Detention Center, so that way we could try to access them with our pro se services. Our legal orientation program tries to connect with any person who's detained that doesn't have a private attorney or pro bono attorney representing them, and we try to give them an orientation so they can better understand what's happening to them, what are their legal rights in this immigration process. And so this was a very useful tool, both for tracking numbers, but also for being able to access folks and making sure we were connecting with as many people as possible who wanted to connect. Unfortunately, over a year ago, yeah, it's been quite a bit of time now since that practice stopped. And so we no longer have precise numbers, and we no longer have this useful tool for connecting with people who are in the detention center, especially folks who don't speak English or Spanish as a first language. We have a lot of posters and literature, and there's word of mouth that gets around, but that is mostly geared towards people who speak English or Spanish. And then there's this whole segment of the Northwest Detention Center population that speaks neither or reads neither. And so that's a really tough situation. We do get limited lists, but it's more based on court dates. And so by the time we get them, sometimes we've already missed the first or second courts. And that's really critical for these cases because I was saying before, the cases can be really prolonged and it's a struggle in that regard. Well, I'm going to talk now about the shift that we've seen in the last several months. I imagine a lot of it due to COVID-19, but some of it predating the COVID crisis. And so to start, the Northwest Detention Center has about 1,500 beds, so that the capacity to hold about 1,500 people in detention. And since I started in 2017, late 2017, we had always been sort of at capacity or at or near capacity. So always hovering close to that 1,500 max capacity mark. And in the beginning of this calendar year, so right around January 2020, we started to see that the numbers were dropping. We were seeing a little bit closer to the 1,000 person mark. And we were imagining, we had seen in other moments where the detention center had started to clear space in certain pods. And pods are what the facility calls their dormitory style housing. So the pods sometimes get cleared and a huge population will come from a different region. And so we were wondering if maybe we were getting ready to receive a lot of people in the early part of the year from other parts of the country, or if maybe the lower numbers were a result of the recent policy changes around asylum, mostly the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, or Remain in Mexico, which required people who were trying to seek asylum in the US to actually wait in Mexico for while their case was proceeding. And so the numbers might have been lower because of that. We weren't sure, we were all just speculating. And then before the COVID crisis really hit, we were getting some numbers around 800 or a little under 1,000 through mostly our clients. If you don't know, in the detention center, every few hours, every several hours, there's a count where every single person who's detained has to be accounted for and counted. And so through this practice, you get an updated number of how many people are actually in the facility. And so those are now the ways that we generally are tracking. And so we're relying on what our clients tell us. Sometimes a guard will just share, oh, this is what the count was. And so I recall, I don't know exactly the date, maybe late February, early March, the numbers were around 800, and we were a little bit surprised that we had not yet bumped back up over 1,000 for quite a bit for several weeks. And then with the COVID crisis hitting, there was a push to get a lot of people out on parole, especially people with medical issues. Unfortunately, not everyone has been released, but the numbers as of the last count that I got word on was around 500. And the rumor was that the intention was to go even lower towards around 300 folks. And how does that tie into the timing of the cases? Well, whereas before there was a huge number of people waiting for their court dates and sometimes really long trajectories for case completion, now it's the opposite sort of problem. Now there's so few, it seems, there's less people and the same number of judges, and the judges are now scheduling people so incredibly quickly that we can't sometimes intervene in time. We can't get to them in time to give them an orientation, or sometimes with a case that we feel we could have referred, we're getting pushback on asking for an extension when the person who we're trying to serve agrees that it's in their best interest to ask for a little bit more time or a certain amount of weeks extra so that we can try to find them representation. There's been a lot of pushback from the court. So now it's sort of in hyperdrive and people are getting processed incredibly quickly, sometimes before they can ever talk to an attorney or to an advocate from the legal orientation program. And ideally, nobody would be forced to go through this process in detention, because then you could possibly move more quickly to find yourself resources and help. But the reality is that by the time sometimes they hear about our services or are able to connect, nowadays it's a little too late. And so it's been a struggle in a different way, but at least there is the news of numbers in the detention center going down, fewer people actually detained. God willing, that doesn't mean that they're just somewhere else. Hopefully that means that it's a national trend, although I can't speak to that. And that's my spiel, my perspective from servicing the detention center, and I'm happy to take questions now or to hold off until the end. So thank you very much for the chance to participate.
Thank you, Anne. Does anybody have any questions? I personally have a question. NERP has how many lawyers?
So in total, I couldn't say exactly, I should know, but we have a staff of about 100. Not all of that is legal staff. We do have quite a big operations team and development team. And beyond lawyers, we do have quite a lot of people who are accredited with the Department of Justice to render immigration services. And we have a lot of legal advocates who also participate in rendering services under supervision of an attorney or an accredited representative. In the Tacoma office, which is the office that has the units which service the Northwest Detention Center, we have about 30, I would say, in total, 30 legal advocates or lawyers working on detained cases or pro se assistance, which for those who might not be aware, pro se assistance is where rather than represent somebody formally in their proceedings as their representative, we're offering sort of almost like technical support so that the detained person can represent themselves to the best of their ability. If they have questions about, I was told I can fill this form out, but I don't know what this question's asking me, or when it says that this is a requirement, what does that mean? What kind of evidence can I present to show that we have a mix of units that do direct rep only for the folks in the detention center, and then my unit which does pro se assistance. And so I would say for the detention center specifically, we have about 25 to 30 individuals that are dedicated to working with that population.
Thank you, Anne. Why don't we let Tonia do her presentation, and then we'll leave room at the end for questions and answers.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tonia Honeycutt, and I am on the AID Northwest Board of Directors. I am part of the governance committee, and I was also a practicing immigration attorney for 3 years in El Paso, Texas. When I came back to Washington, I wanted to still provide services for immigrants, but I didn't want to provide direct representation. So I was asked to put together kind of a little bit of an overview, because there's some confusion about what types of statuses, like when people are released from the detention center, how does that happen? So I just put together, this is a very, very brief overview. This does not cover a lot of specifics, because every immigration case is very fact heavy. It depends on the individual, it depends on their circumstances, what their personal life is like, family context. So this is meant to be very brief and just a general overview of the types. Give me just a second to bring up a PowerPoint that I put together. Okay. Everybody see it? I hope so. Okay, so as you know, Anne just discussed, here in the Northwest Detention Center, it's run by the GEO Group. It's located in the Port of Tacoma, down by the Tide Flats. There is an immigration court in the detention center, which is known as the Executive Office of Immigration Review, or also known as EOIR. That is the court that hears the detained cases. The current population, Anne just discussed some of the people that are already there, and the community members it can be people that are detained from the local community in the Pacific Northwest region, but it can also be asylum seekers that are transferred from anywhere in the United States, as well as they do transfer from, if there's overcrowding within one detention center, they will do transfers at that point as well. There are 2 courts in our region. Seattle hosts the non-detained cases, and Tacoma, as we just discussed, kind of hosts all the non-detained cases. So what happens? This is kind of a quick overview of how you end up in removal proceedings, or how you end up discriminated. The first 2 questions are, is the individual removable? Were they inadmissible or deportable? If so, is there a defense to deportation, asylum, cancellation of removal? What are their family ties? Are they able to petition for a family-based petition? Who is removable? Anyone who doesn't have lawful status or an expired status in the United States. Some legal permanent residents due to criminal convictions. How do immigrants enter the removal process? Well, the number 1 reason is there was some type of interaction with the justice system. ICE detains an individual, like if they've been arrested, even if they've only been charged with a crime, they don't have to have been convicted in order to be transferred to ICE detention. If they were on probation after, a plea deal, and they get in touch with their probation officer, there is a very interesting thing. So if a application is applied for with United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, they can actually refer a case to the immigration court if it's denied. So it's kind of like it would be like the appeals process for USCIS. If you're pulled over or stopped within 100 miles of the border by either a border checkpoint, ICE, ICE officials, you will, and you don't have lawful status, you can be detained at that point. People in removal proceedings, they can release those individuals. However, the trend has been that they actually detain them. And anybody who requests asylum at a port of entry or a border crossing, a lot of them are placed into removal or into the detention center to wait out their removal proceedings. who's specifically detained here at the Pacific Northwest? As I said, I don't provide direct representation, but based on my experience and kind of what I know about the immigration system, a lot of people are asylum seekers that have been transferred from different borders where they have requested asylum, legal permanent residents, and anybody who has been charged with particular crimes, people who have overstayed their visa. A visa allows you to lawfully enter the United States, but it also has an expiration date. If you stay beyond that expiration date, and you end up apprehended for whatever reason, you can be placed in the detention center if you're undocumented. And the other one is unaccompanied youth that have aged out of the foster system. Some of the children that came into the United States, they were able, they were able to get services. Unfortunately, I have never really truly had firsthand experience dealing with unaccompanied youth, other than applying for a couple of their SIJs, special immigrant juvenile visas. So I'm not exactly sure how many that this happens to, or what are the circumstances, but it is a fact that some of them do end up in the detention center. So the first step is they determine, once they've detained someone, most people, and I say most because there are some that are not eligible for bond, but most people are eligible for bond if they can provide that they are not a flight risk, they're not a danger to the community, they're not charged with a serious crime, and they don't have an existing deportation order. In other words, they haven't been deported before. A lot of judges, they have specific requirements for when you put their bond documentation together. It asks for address, family members, people. You try to create as many ties to the local community as you can for each of the individuals, so that way you know that they're going to continue with their case. They have interest in going to every court hearing that is scheduled. And then one of the big ones, asylum. So asylum provides protection for individuals who fear being persecuted in their home country. It's based on protected classes: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Membership in a particular social group is probably one of the number one areas, because it's the broadest category. It's not truly defined, and it's defined strictly by case law. So it depends on what's been approved before and how other cases have been dealt with, that determines what is a particular social group and whether or not it applies. For example, it can be, at one point, domestic violence was a particular social group. Being female may be a particular social group, or being a wife. And again, it's based on whatever is happening within the case law within those areas. It has to be specific to the individual. It can't be general civil strife or economic harm or hardship, because those are not general. They're too general. They have to be specific to the individual to show persecution. The individual still has to prove that the government cannot or will not, or is unable to, protect the individual from whatever group is harming them. So either the government is doing it, or there's a group that the government is failing to control. So the person also has to prove that they can't relocate. Relocation would be such a hardship to them to relocate to somewhere else within the country. For example, if they're persecuted in the northern half of the country, but moving to the southern half would actually provide them with assurance that they could get away from that group, they have to show that that's not reasonable within their own circumstances. Generally speaking, asylum has to be applied for within 1 year of arrival. There was a law that was in place that said that it was an executive order by Trump that said that individuals who entered the country to seek asylum after July 16th of 2019, who passed through a third country and didn't apply for and receive a denial of asylum from that country, they were barred from receiving asylum in the United States. Currently, that order is enjoined from enforcement, but this is where we end up with a lot of those individuals who are released with a granted withholding of removal or a protection under CAT. Those are, it's like a subset of asylum. So we had some questions because technically an individual with withholding of removal or CAT, they are not, they don't have a pathway to become part of the United States. There's no, they can't become a legal permanent resident. There's no pathway to citizenship. They can't adjust their status. They're just stuck in limbo, but they're here and they're authorized a work permit. So I kind of did this slide talks about all of the things that are alike within the two. They're authorized to work in the United States. If the court hears an asylum claim, because you always apply for asylum, withholding of removal, and CAT at the same time. It's harder to show withholding of removal or CAT, but if you're able to, it's mandatory. It's not discretionary. The judge has no, they don't really have the ability to apply discretionary standards if you can show that the persecution is more likely than not. The individuals cannot travel outside the United States. They can't petition for their family members. Their family members can also apply for withholding of removal or Convention Against Torture, but they can't, there's no derivative applications. So each person has to go through a hearing on their own. The government can terminate your status after granting withholding removal or under CAT. The biggest difference with withholding of removal, you have to show a clear probability of persecution. However, under Convention Against Torture, you have to demonstrate torture, not persecution. And it has to be by the government or with its acquiescence. In other words, they're allowing it to happen to this person. So those kind of explain the reasons or what people, where they're at when they are released from the detention center. As we've talked about, AID Northwest, we provide transportation and housing assistance for individuals. Northwest Immigrants Rights Project, which Anne is part of, they provide direct representation. And there is another one that I actually found when I was looking for some other resources regarding, there's a public charge law that was placed into effect. And protecting immigrant families provides a lot of information, especially in light of COVID-19, where people that are immigrants can actually find services within their local communities for healthcare. So if, these are definitely resources that we have here in the Pacific Northwest to help individuals. So now I'm going to leave this open to really questions, so that way you can find out what it is that what questions do you guys have about the immigration process here? I think somebody has their hand up. Renee?
On the Q&A block, I see a question from Beth. What is a pro se attorney?
So I briefly mentioned earlier the distinction between a direct representative and somebody who does direct representation is somebody's attorney of record goes with somebody to court or to the asylum office for interviews and does all of the pieces that you would imagine your lawyer would do for you if you signed them up to represent you. For pro se assistance, attorneys or legal advocates are coming in with that legal expertise in immigration law, but we're not signing up any person to represent them in court. We're sort of there to try to help them understand what they're about to go into with their immigration court proceedings, or at any stage in that proceedings, if they have questions that come up, to be able to provide guidance, basically give them information to help them represent themselves to the best of their abilities. And so some concrete examples of what we might do is if they, as I mentioned before, were given forms to fill out and they don't understand specific questions because there's technical terms, we try to explain to them what is being asked. When they're not sure exactly what they need to demonstrate for their specific type of case, we can give them information packets and walk them through it in terms of what are the requirements for being able to be successful in your case. What types of evidence do courts typically like to see in these types of cases? What is relevant? And so it's sort of guiding them through without actually being in court with them and representing them and speaking on their behalf or writing arguments in their case.
There is a question by Jonathan. Does no path to citizenship also include marriage to a citizen?
Sorry, I lost the screen. No, I mean, if you're eligible, I mean, somebody who's here on withholding of removal, it doesn't give them lawful status, but they're eligible. If they were to marry a United States citizen, they could potentially become eligible for other types of petitions. It's just as far as withholding, it doesn't provide them with legal status. That gives them a pathway to citizenship at the time. So if they were to marry a United States citizen, it's possible, but it also depends on that individual's circumstances.
Susan is asking how many individuals are deemed eligible for bond but are stuck at the NWDC because they don't have the financial resources to post bond.
Like I said, I'm not actively participating, but Anne may have some insight on that.
Yeah, I don't have specific numbers, but we do see quite a lot of people through our, or I guess now talk to on our hotline, specifically asking for bond assistance, help either covering bond or finding sources or companies that can do bond loans. And, you know, that's not really where we can shine. We try to give them what information we have, but the typical bond, I don't know if these numbers are now old, but the average bond was in Tacoma was set at $12,000. And unlike in the criminal system where you can pay a percentage, you have to pay the entirety of the amount all at once for immigration bond. So it's a big struggle. A lot of folks are in that position where they can't cover the bond that they were given, and so they have to remain. But I don't have precise numbers. I'm seeing less bonds given, unfortunately, and so now I'm seeing less of that phenomenon where somebody was actually granted a bond and couldn't get out. I don't know if somebody else maybe has more information than that.
No, I actually think that's good information, because I know when I was practicing, you know, at one point it was, you know, we would get like $5,000 bonds, and again, it's always the location in which you're at determines, you know, and kind of whatever's going on within the political realm. But and then at one point we were up to $25,000 bonds. So it really, there's a lot of variance as far as what that looks like.
Yeah, I would say that just within our office, if a bond is set below 10,000, we think that's like really special, really amazing.
There was also, the same person asked a question about how often are detained individuals granted asylum while they're at the Northwest Detention Center. I don't have the specific numbers on that, but the EOIR does post kind of the statistics. I know for a while there, they were posting the statistics by judge. I don't know if they're still doing that,
Yeah, I haven't seen the most recent, I haven't checked recently, but the track, I forget what it stands for, but I think it's out of Syracuse University. It's TRAC. If you look up track asylum rates, they would have historical data by judge. Um, Again, this is a little old, but when we last were actively checking track the numbers, or I guess the statistics around Tacoma judges, we were right around 23% grant rate for asylum seekers. So some jurisdictions, it's almost 0% grant rates, which is absurd. And some jurisdictions are way higher than above 60%. So we're up towards the low end, but we're not the worst. But I think across our 3 sitting judges, it was around 23% grant rate for asylum.
Wow, that's.
Oh, and I do see that there was a follow-up question regarding the bond. What are some of the bond sources besides the Fair Fight Bond Fund? I think this one's hard because a lot of them deplete and then have a period of inactivity, and then you're not sure exactly when they come back on. I participate as one of the a sort of like steering committee or like board members of a bond fund called Free Our Neighbors, but that is one where we get requests from community-based like organizing groups, so it would be through a connection probably with Resistencia, and so that's one, the Free Our Neighbors Bond Fund, and the National Bail Network. I would just sort of try to connect with them and see if they know who is active in any given region, because it does seem to be quite regional based. So like famously Raíces in Texas, if the person is going to be released to Texas or has a Texas connection, you can still go to Raíces, and they seem to have some bond fund money still in their pool. And so those are just some thoughts, but not exhaustive at all.
So the next question asks, if a person had legal residency for many years here in the US and lived with family in the US, then commits a crime and is imprisoned, once they serve their time, can they be reunited with their US family who are residents? What are the chances if the crime was transporting drugs across the border?
Oh, okay. That sounds like a very specific question. I mean, it would depend. If the individual was a legal permanent resident, it would depend on whether they're eligible for a form of relief. And depending on the amount of drugs, I mean, there are a lot of factors that would play into determining whether or not that person would be allowed to remain within the United States.
Yeah, usually when it's like a very case specific question like this, I would suggest that if there is somebody you're concerned about, that they call for intake, so that way the attorney or the advocate would need to have really specific information, like Tonia was saying, about what was actually what was the status of is it a conviction, what was the conviction for, and so it would need to be incredibly fact specific. As Tonia was saying, it's really hard to give broad answers. And so I would suggest they call up for an intake at the, whichever, if they can't pay for an attorney, whichever NERP office is closest to them. We have 4 offices, 1 in Seattle, 1 in Tacoma, and 2 in Eastern Washington, based in Granger and Wenatchee. So you can always call for a consult.
How does a detainee show proof of their condition, like fear of life?
Well, one of the many ways is actually using the World Book, going through news articles. I mean, if they have a specific situation, if there are police reports, and unfortunately, it's very rare that they actually have police reports or true proof that it occurred. But you can use other information, such as common knowledge. Like I said, the World Book. There's information that's put out by different groups, especially if it's considered a terrorist organization or a gang, that may help you show that person is a fear of persecution. Torture is probably one of the harder ones, just because sometimes they do have actual proof. the medical records, and you know those can be extremely heartbreaking, at least for me. Can you, Anne, do you have any other sources that you can think of specifically that you guys use to show persecution?
Well, specific to the person, like you said, it's often really hard. If you have time, you can try to do a medical evaluation to see if there's physical, like if it's demonstrable on the body that somebody has been tortured or harmed. Psychological evaluations can help to demonstrate that some of the symptoms that the person's displaying, maybe when they're talking about their past harm, demonstrates that it's the way that they articulate what happened is consistent with how a survivor of trauma would articulate it. And we use a lot of country conditions background information to show that the stuff that the person is recounting is sort of in line with what we know from government reports or reports from intergovernmental or nonprofit organizations. And then the other big thing besides the person's own words and testimony and declaration is if there's any maybe direct eyewitness, or at least if not direct eyewitness, if somebody was aware of what was happening at the time that it was happening. Perhaps they didn't see the person getting tortured, but they were called right after the person escaped and picked them up and saw them in a state, then they can write an affidavit saying this is what I know. And so it's not direct proof, but it can all be used to strengthen the testimony of the person who's seeking asylum or protection.
The next question is asking about just like the situation about COVID-19 in the NWDC. Is there any information on like testing available that's inside? Any number of positive cases that are known? Is the COVID situation affecting the release numbers?
I'm trying to find the question, so I'm sorry if I miss one. Feel free to jump back in and let me know if I miss anything. So in terms of testing at this facility, there is sort of available testing. It's not mandatory, so most people seem to be opting in and getting swabbed, but there are folks who refuse, and so that's a little bit disconcerting because it only takes one person to sort of one undetected carrier to spread it. But as far as I can tell, there hasn't been a widespread, there hasn't been anything widespread. The two cases that I heard of that were people in the detention center who tested positive had been separated and were in quarantine and had been transported from other facilities. And so it seems that they never actually, as far as the detention center says, interacted with the general population. The difficulty there is that guards go between the quarantine area and the non-quarantine area. So we continue to push for release of anybody who's not, anybody who, in our view, it's just a dangerous situation. You can't really do it safely. And so, so I would posit that until people are allowed to actually be out of the detention center, they're not going to be able to safely distance. But there is testing. It's opt-in, non-mandatory, and there have been positive cases, but those cases have been identified before the person was allowed into the general population, and they were put into a quarantine before being allowed to mingle with the rest of the population.
A quick follow-up to just like the COVID situation, like is there a reason that you guys are aware of why individuals would opt out?
I don't personally know that why folks decide not to, but the fear from folks I've talked to is that there are people who have said no and they just declined to do it. I don't know the reasoning. I think there was also a part of the question that was, have we seen releases or anything like that in response? Or was there something else to the question that I might have missed earlier?
Like, is COVID affecting the number of people being released?
Oh, I do think after quite a lot of pushing that there have been greater releases on parole, which before we didn't see that often. Parole being sort of the alternative to bond for getting out. Judges can grant bond. ICE can also grant bonds, but they typically just automatically decline to, and so it's the judge that gets a second chance to see if a bond might be appropriate. But the ICE officers themselves, the ICE officer in charge of any single person's case, can receive a petition for parole to be released either under supervision or with ankle monitors or whatever conditions they think is necessary to ensure that the person will return and for their proceedings. And so we hadn't been seeing too many parole requests granted pre-COVID, and now there's been some that have, when there's an identifiable underlying medical issue that makes somebody particularly susceptible to COVID, and when there's not too many negative factors, things that the deportation officers tend to look at very carefully is criminal history. And so if somebody doesn't have significant criminal history and has significant medical issues, we've been seeing those people paroled out, whereas before we wouldn't have expected that to happen. So it does seem to be tied specifically to COVID.
Is there a limit on how long an individual can be held?
Do you want me to start, or do you want to jump in, Tonia? Well, there are limits. It can be difficult to push for release even when it's been a prolonged detention. But the limits really start to play in once somebody has concluded their case. So if you are ordered removed by the judge and that order is an administratively final order, that means you're not appealing it up, you're just sort of deportable at that time. The U.S. government typically has 90 days to, not typically, by statute, by law, has 90 days to execute that removal order. But that can be extended any number of times. Usually there's one extension that happens as a matter of course if the government hasn't been able to, for whatever reason, arrange the removal of the person. But after that second 90-day period, so after 180 days, there is where sometimes you can successfully argue that you should be released because the government has now taken so long that it's become prolonged detention and it's violating your constitutional rights. And so through a habeas petition in federal court, you can move for your release, or at least for a bond hearing, to see if you might be a good candidate for release. And typically that fight will center around whether the government can demonstrate that they have like a reasonably reliable chance that they're going to be removing you in the proximate future, because they've already taken so long that at that point the court might want to see that they're actually making moves, that there's actually travel documents have been issued or a flight plan or something like that. And if the government can't show that, then typically the person will be released on an order of supervision. So they might have to continue to go to the ICE office every so often to make sure that they're still there, but they wouldn't be detained. If you're before that, if you're in your proceedings and you haven't been ordered removed with a final administrative order, then you have to sort of hope that you're bond eligible. But if you're not, then that's when you get the cases that I was mentioning, 13 months or more, where you're detained and it's all legal, and it's not right, but it's legal.
Yeah, prolonged detention is definitely, I mean, unfortunately, the harder it is to get the information for the asylum claim, the longer that, an individual is willing to stay there because, they want the best opportunity to have a positive outcome in their case.
Can you tell us more about the executive order barring people from requesting asylum if they passed through a country and didn't request asylum there first? What's the background on this, and how do you see this evolving?
Okay, so the background on that is it went into effect, like I said, in June of 2016. It was enjoined there was a stay to say that they couldn't put it into law, and then it was taken away. And then March of 2020, they came back and said, wait, you didn't follow, this executive order doesn't follow the appropriate standard that it should have in order to become effective. So they enjoined it again. So what does that mean? So it makes this very odd situation that anybody who had their case decided between, during one of the times of when it wasn't enjoined, they have an opportunity to go back, and if they can show that there's a change in circumstances, if they can show that there's some type of change in circumstances, they may be able to reopen their case. But we're not sure exactly how this is going to play out, because as of right now, there is a 193-page rulemaking that is in process on this exact thing. So yes, if you pass through, say, somebody from Guatemala, they passed through Mexico, and they didn't apply in Mexico, then it's an automatic denial of an asylum here. I mean, that's pretty much what it comes down to, is that if you pass through any other country, and if you think about that, there's only two countries that you don't pass through a third country. That's Canada and Mexico. So it does create an almost impossibility for asylum claims to be heard. We don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know whether that's going to allow people to continue to apply for asylum, and we don't know if the stay is going to be upheld, or if it's going to, the injunction, if it's going to be upheld, or if the executive order, they're going to change what they're doing and how they're doing it. It does have a huge impact on immigration and the way that cases are argued. As I said before, we've talked about case law determines how a particular thing is defined. So whether it's a particular social group or political opinion, it's defined within case law. And I think that there is definitely an opportunity to make positive changes. Unfortunately, I have a feeling that these will be negative changes to the immigration world.
Do the guards pose a COVID risk to the detainees?
Well, I haven't been in the detention center now for some time. We're limiting our presence there too, partly because of that fear that, we're the risk, and the same thing with the guards. We're out in the world, and then we come into the detention center where people can't distance. From my clients, I've heard that it's not I don't know how this has developed, but at least as of last month, or perhaps it was May, there was not a strict requirement that guards had to be wearing gloves and masks. And so some of them, they would have the masks around their neck, or they would pull it down anytime they wanted to. Sometimes they wouldn't use gloves, and there was a lot of trepidation around going to the guards to get masks and gloves. When you want one, you have to go to the guard and they will distribute them. But then this guard who's not wearing mask or gloves is the one that's touching every single set. And so there was, at least from one client, a lot of trepidation around that. I know that in other facilities, guards have also tested positive. I think there was one in Louisiana who actually passed away. And so since they're human, yeah, I think that they do pose a COVID risk. Any person who goes in potentially does. And so that is a particular concern that would be a source of risk to the detained population there.
What are we to make of the sharp decline in numbers at Tacoma Detention Center? Is it like a good sign across the country, or just a pause because of COVID? Or is it before something stronger against immigrants because it's around election time.
I don't know if I have a specific take on it. Or I don't. Sorry, that I don't know that NERP has a specific take on it. But personally, I think it's a combination of factors. Until recently, a lot of people being held under the Remain in Mexico. I mean, even and then with COVID, there was like a slight, I think, slowing down of enforcement. We used to see a lot more people picked up in the community outside of courtrooms and everything, and that seems to have slowed. And then in terms of whether that's across the nation or in our region, I don't actually have a strong sense. If I had to just posit a guess from casually talking to other immigration attorneys in other regions, I would say that they're not seeing as low of numbers as we are seeing in the Northwest Detention Center. I think I was in Louisiana previously, so I have a lot of my contacts from Louisiana. There it seems to continue to be high population, and I couldn't anticipate if it's going to remain slow or if we're going to start seeing some bigger numbers. Does anybody else have maybe some of their own personal insight? I think it's a combination of factors, not just COVID.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think that it does with the Remain in Mexico, because now we don't have as many people coming in to request asylum. I think that there's a lot of factors, and as far as what does that mean for the future, I don't know.
Tonia, do you speak to your friends in El Paso anymore? Have you heard from them?
I do. I actually stay in contact with a lot of the immigration attorneys. I know that their COVID was a huge problem with guards. There were several that had tested positive, and then there were also detainees that tested positive for COVID, as well as immigration attorneys. So I know that that's always been kind of an interesting. It's definitely an interesting time that we live in right now.
Okay, are there any other questions for our panelists?
I do have one question. Renee asked a question about, to clarify, she wants to know changes to status levels, specifically any recent changes to removal proceedings or changes to granting of asylum. The change that I talked about with the executive order is really it is the number one change that occurred within how asylums are looked at from the executive branch. Like that was their big change. And I hope I answered the question by saying we're not sure where this is going to go. As of right now, like I said, they're not using that as the standard, but that's of March 2020. It doesn't mean that they can't make that the standard. Did that clarify it, Renee?
Actually, I have one final question I'll pose to you, Anne. We certainly aren't still keeping children longer than 90 days, are we?
Well, I'm not well versed with the policies and rules around children. I do see a question about whether any detainees at the Northwest Detention Center are minors and what percentage of those are unaccompanied by parents or guardians. And so again, I don't know the percentage of unaccompanied children we're seeing at the border, but at the Northwest Detention Center, it's only adults. So we do see folks who are transferred on their literal 18th birthday, but we don't see under 18. And so the folks that are youth who are minors are typically held in facilities run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR facilities, and they tend to come from Portland for some reason, but we don't actually have minors at the Northwest Detention Center. Perhaps Tonia has more information about Tim's question regarding the 90-day rule. I actually can't speak to those rules. I'm not familiar with them.
Unfortunately, I'm not really familiar with them either. I know that in New Mexico, there is a specific facility that holds children If they came with a parent, they try to keep them together, but it doesn't always happen. And unfortunately, I don't know the length of detention, so I think that it's outside the scope of what I can answer.
I do see one last question that says, how is COVID-19 affecting removal operations? How much have actual removals been slowed down or stopped due to the pandemic? And as I was mentioning, the court process, at least in the detained court specifically, has been going faster. So you get more people actually getting ordered removed in the detained context. The non-detained courts are still closed for the most part. But on the flip side, the countries where people are being repatriated to have started to shut down their borders to us, because we have sent quite a few people who have been infected to different countries. And so in that regard, it's slowed down because some countries are now refusing to issue travel documents or to take repatriated people. And so there it slows down the process. So you have like a faster administrative process, but a slower practical process. And so sometimes you get into these situations where we briefly touched on with the prolonged detention, where somebody's like, I've been ordered removed, I've been waiting, and my country won't take me. And so there you might have an argument that after 180 days, it's become prolonged detention, it's unconstitutional, and the person should be at least allowed to remain in the community while the situation shakes out.
Sounds like a benefit of COVID-19. I can't believe it.
The rare thing, the rare positive.
Susan just posted an article that, according to the New York Times, they are releasing, the judge has ordered that all immigrant children in detention have to be released by Friday, July 17th.
All right. Okay.
So, definitely, thank you so much for posting that. I wasn't aware.
All right. Anything else? Any other questions? Well, thank you to all of our panelists. I really appreciate it. It's good to meet you, Anne. I've never met you before. Deborah and Tonia I know very well. We just had a marathon board meeting last night. And Stephanie, who you don't see, thank you for being our major domo, keeping things organized. Please don't forget, if you have any suggestions for future programs, please email them to Deborah. That's dcruz at AIDNW.org. Is that right, Deborah? I think so. And if there's nothing else, I will conclude the session. Thank you especially to Anne. I really appreciate it. Yay.
Of course. I appreciate the opportunity to join with you all. Have a good one. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I just wanted to let everyone know that I did post the New York Times article in the chat on the right-hand side. So anybody who wants to review that, grab the link before you leave.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.